welcome to Tell Muses, a podcast by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers, and for anyone interested in stories. Today, Despina and I are really happy to welcome for the last interview of the first season, the wonderful, the one and only Mike Rust. Hello, Mike, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We're very excited to have you here.
Well, good
Welcome, Mike.
morning. It's lovely to meet you both. I've met Despina in person, but I haven't met you, Simona, in person.
Yes.
And it's really multi-European thing at the moment. I'm in England, one in Italy, one in Greece. So here we go. Good morning, and what can I do for you?
So, Mike, usually we start this interview by asking our guests. So, you're our muse today in Tell Muses. You'll be our muse. So,
Right.
I'd like you, if you can, to tell us a few things about who Mike Rust is.
Who Mike Rust is. Right. So Mike Rust is from the Welsh borders. So the Welsh borders or the Welsh Marsh, and the Marsh is an old England name, it's an old Saxon name for border. So if you think of the United Kingdom, you think of England and Wales, we're halfway up on the English side. I've lived there all my adult life. My childhood was going from one school to another because my father got promoted a lot. And every time he got promoted, we moved schools. Then I lived in France for a bit. And then Lynn and I got married in 1977 and we came to live here and we've lived here ever since. Like I said, Lynn is my wife all these years and I have two children and two grandchildren. And my hobby is telling stories more than it is my profession, for the simple reason is that years ago, in 1980s sometimes, I got a job telling stories on the west coast of Ireland. So I went out to the west coast of Ireland, I left on a Monday morning, coming back on a Friday afternoon. And if you're in a school, and I don't particularly like schools particularly, at 4 o'clock, everybody wants you to go home and they don't want to see you till 9 o'clock the next morning. I'm on the west coast of Ireland. There's only one decision to make is when are you going to have something to eat and when are you going to have 4 pints of Guinness, right? So I have 4 pints of Guinness. Then I go to bed, get up the next morning. I was married and had two children there. And I didn't want to spend my life doing that. So I consciously came back and said to Lynn, I can be a storyteller, but I want to be a storyteller in Shropshire and I want to live with my wife and my children. And so we decided the best thing to do was to start a festival and get all the other storytellers to come to here. So that's what we did. So if that's my storytelling life, and we'll get to Amy Douglas at some point along the lines here, but that's basically how it worked for me in my storytelling life. And I've been running a club and running festivals on and off all those years. Okay, is that the answer you wanted? Okay.
Absolutely. And Mike, how did your passion for stories and storytelling start?
Right, the creation myth, as we call it. Right, so we needed a house to live in, so I bought a house for £7,000 in 1977. It wasn't a very big house, it was a 2 up and 2 down, it didn't have a roof. And I was working and doing the house up, and somehow along those lines, Lynn got pregnant. Don't know how that happened, but Lynn got pregnant. And the way I was making a bit of beer money at the time, I was trained to be a forester for the Forestry Commission. That's the national authority here in the UK. And once a month, on a Sunday, I'd cut up logs, and I had a pickup truck. I'd cut up logs, and I'd take them to the pub, and I'd sell a load of logs for beer money because that was my beer money for the month. Now, I was thinking about this about half an hour ago. A truckload of logs nowadays is worth about £100 in UK money, and a pint of beer is about £5 a pint. So you get that amount of beer, and that would be my beer allowance for the month. And the numbers are relative, they're just smaller. So I went and did that one Sunday morning, and I popped into the pub. As I walked into the pub, the local Morris dance team were there, and they were just having a ceilidh, is what the Welsh would call it. It was a tune session. And this is in Herefordshire. So this is on the Welsh March. And they were playing music and stuff like that. And I just loved it. I thought it was great. I went and got there, and then we came back and we sat in the pub. And there was all these people with violins and fiddles and flutes, and they were just playing tunes. And I did notice that the more tunes they played, the more beer they were given. So, and people having their Sunday lunch and stuff like that. And I thought, oh, great. Okay. So anyway, they invited me to join them because I happened to. They invite everybody to join them. So I went and joined them. And so we were dancing. And what we used to do was on a Thursday night, we used to do 3 pubs in the winter. So we find a pub, dance outside of it, go to another pub, dance outside of that, go to the 3rd pub about 9 o'clock at night, dance outside of that, go in and have a session. And so, and we tell them beforehand, and the pubs in those days in England used to close at 9:30, 10:30 in the evening. And we had a song, and the barman would always say, the landlord, oh, the Morris men were here. That's okay. We'll stay open late. Well, the expression will have a lock-in. Right, so we'll have a lock-in. And through that period, a couple of times, somebody stood up and they'd pick a glass up with a spoon and go tick, tick, tick with a spoon and go, pray quiet for the storyteller. And everybody would just sit down. And I was absolutely fascinated with this. And we went to a harvest home. Now, a harvest home is in the autumn, is where we all sit down to celebrate the end of the harvest. And you always end up with apple pie and cream. It's always roast beef and Yorkshire pud and apple pie and cream. And a lot of cider, because they drink cider down there. And Dougie Isles stood up. And he was the sort of entertainment for that evening. And he was a storyteller from the Forest of Dean, which is just a bit further south. And he told a couple of stories. One is Yam the Cricketer. And another was, and the stories we told in them days are little ghosty odd stories. They're mainly little ghosty tales of one kind or another. And I thought this was brilliant. And so a couple of times later, we're in the White Horse at Checkley, which is a tiny, I think the pub's closed nowadays. And exactly this happened. And a fellow called Dave Jones, who's my mentor in a lot of ways, a great friend of mine, with his first wife who died, he stood up and picked up a glass and a spoon. He went tick, 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 pray quiet for the storyteller. And everybody sat down, including me. And he looked at me and he goes, come on, Rust, you're on. And I went, pardon? He said, come on, you're on. Stand up and tell a story. And everybody looked at me. And as I was standing up, the adrenaline was running down the inside of my leg. Okay. And I sat and told a story. And everybody clapped and all the others came over because they were all in on it. The only person who didn't know was me. Right. And so, and they all said, you did that ever so well and everything else. And so I became the storyteller to the team, the troop of Morrismen. And what I found was that the more I told the stories, the more people from the community would come and tell me more stories. And so, particularly the old boys, and the old boys they like, and the old, when I mean old boys, I mean the generation in the 1970s, there was 70, 80, 90, male and female. Okay. And they'd come along and they'd say, we haven't heard that story for years. No one does that anymore. It's really interesting you're doing it. Do you know the one about this? And they'd sit and tell me the one about this. Right? And so that Christmas, I was working and Rose, and now Rose had nothing to do with the storytelling or the folklore or anything else. She was just someone I worked with. And she came on, she said, you need to go to Kington and meet Edgar. And I went, why do I need to do that? She said, because he's the one who tells a story about Blackbourne. And Knighton is 30 odd miles, something like that. So I said to Lynn, come on, one evening we're going to, and he said he always watches the football on a Saturday afternoon in the pub. And find out whichever team it was. I think it was one of the Welsh teams. He said, when they're playing, he'll be there an hour before. He won't want to talk to you when he's watching the football, but he'll talk to you before the game for 10 minutes and tell you all about Blackbourne. I said, well, okay, well, I will do it, Rose, but why in particular should I go and see him? She said, well, he's my uncle, and I've told him he's got to tell you the story because you're interested, and we don't know anybody else who's interested. I went, okay. So off we went, sat down there, met this bloke, and he looked at me and he said, "There's one rule about all this, Rust." And I went, "What's that?" He said, "If I tell you, we trade stories. If you tell me one, I've got to tell you one, and vice versa." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll tell you one." He said, "It doesn't matter if it's one I already know." I said, "No, that's all right." So I told him one. He said, "No, I actually didn't know that one." I told him about Robin Hood and Mordred, which is a forest down by it. And he told me Blackpool. And so that moved it on again. And that was a big leap forward because it took me out of the Morris teams and the folklore and all that kind of stuff. And it moved me out into the community because Rose decided that I needed to do it. And I saw her the other day. She's about our age. She's a grandmother. And she follows me around on TikTok and all the other things after all these years and everything else. And she quite rightly says, "I helped that old bugger when he was first starting out in 1977, 78. Okay. So that's how it started for me.
So your first time was a deep, a dive in the deep, actually. You were just thrown in the water.
I was just thrown in the water. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not a bad way. It can end bad. It can end badly if you do that to other people, which is nowadays we have clubs. We encourage people, virgin storytellers, the ones that have never done it before. And so we create an atmosphere where it's easy for them to do it. And we do that absolutely on purpose. And we invite people to come along and do it. And we run a club called Words at the Edge nowadays in Much Wenlock. We had someone come and do it two
We
meetings
will
ago.
come back to that. But
Yeah,
before
we'll come.
we
Yeah,
get
yeah.
there, Michael,
Yeah,
I have
okay.
many, many questions. Um, so I'm going to start with the most ridiculous one, I think.
Go on.
People who don't know about Morris dancers, look it up. It's really, really interesting.
Right, of
So
course,
it's
yes.
traditional.
Absolutely.
I'll say what I know about it, and you correct me if I get something wrong. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah. No, we have to say
Okay.
that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what I've seen is people dress up in costumes, colorful costumes, wearing hats and bells on their legs, and they hold this kind of wooden swords. I wonder whether at some point it could have been real swords back in the day. Who knows? So
Yeah.
nowadays they're holding wooden swords, and they do this kind of circular dance where they play in couples. Let us say, wielding their swords in the air and knocking them together on high up in the air and then lower to the ground, and then they exchange couples. So have I got it right so far, Mike?
It's not bad for someone who lives in Greece. I'll get
Just
100%.
by looking
Absolutely 100%. Right, absolutely. For anybody who doesn't live in England, so how do you explain it? The first time it was mentioned in the official archive of England and the Kingdom of England was at the sisters of Henry VII's wedding. Her name was Margaret, and there is £1 in expenses to pay the Morris men. And that is 1490 or something along those lines, 1450, something along those lines. And it's our traditional dance. It's the dance that's come through from every culture everywhere has a traditional dance of some time where the men go out and dance and the women go out and dance and the women and the men dance together. And this is the one that's come through in England. It's now danced more by women than it is by men. The swords you're talking about are sticks. They're never swords, they're sticks. And sometimes you have long sticks, which is about a yard or a meter in your thing, or a shorter one. And they're collected and they're handed down through these books. I mean, people have conferences on them. There's great festivals all over the country, and there's great parades. And one of the most famous one, and there's many, many, but let's take the rush carts where you in the Pennines. What happens is they go up onto the moors, they cut all the rushes down, they put them on a big cart, and they go into every church and they take the rushes from last year and they throw them away and they renew the every year. And then you go to a pub, then all the men dance outside the pub, and the women and the mixed teams and all the rest of it, they all dance out the pub. then you go to another church, then you go to another pub, and you spend the day doing that. And that's been done for 600 years, 700 years, something along those lines. And all the people come out and line all the streets. So the whole communities come out, and the high streets get stopped, and you're dancing away. And it's a very religious place, that part of the world, because you've got to go to 17 churches, and then you have to have 17 points. Okay.
Have you ever seen any Morris dancing, Simona? You haven't.
No, no.
Okay. I'd say that the music they dance to sounds medieval to my ears. Probably before
Absolutely.
that.
Right. So the first tune that was written down is in the 980s, and it's called "Speed the Plough" and the Curly Head Ploughboy. And it was actually written down in 970s, 80s, something like that. But they must have been played centuries before. They just didn't know how to write it down, so it was just passed down. So,
of course,
and we still use those tunes today. They're the same tunes as we say. I can play. I thought I might have to play a tune at some point, so I've got it all ready here, so we can play a tune. But that's
cool.
The Morris. We're talking about stories more than the Morris. So the history of the Morris is that, and I stopped doing it when I got into my 40s and 50s. I'm 70 now, because my knees were creaking a bit. But I have taught it, and it's the other string of what I do as much as anything when I'm not storytelling and running festivals. When I want to go and sit and do not a lot and just watch other people do, I'm happy to go and watch some Morris dance. Okay.
So here comes my ridiculous question as to Morris dancing. It's very lively, and people are jumping and jingling and knocking their sticks, which of course they would be sticks because it's kind of rural. They wouldn't have swords at the villages, I suppose. You're right. And there is a lot of alcohol consumption, as you said, but this has to be very meticulous. Where you need to know where exactly you're going to hit the other person's stick. So, have there been any weird incidents with Morris dancers knocking each other out or whatever?
There's loads of them. Absolutely sticks it breaking and all things. Some of the funniest ones, the ones that here on, because there's 5 or 6 different types. I think the best one I ever saw was because we disguised ourselves in those days, and that we used to put black on the front. Now that's changed in the 21st century for all sorts of political reasons, quite rightly, mine. But there was a policeman on duty, and the policeman was standing there, on duty, and he's going like this to the cars in the crossroads and saying, "Stop there and come back," and everything else. And somebody I know, and I'm not going to own up to it, got behind him, and all the cars were doing what the Morris men did and not what the policeman did. So the policeman went like that. I'd be behind going, come on, this way. And he turned round and he turned round and said, "If there's a Morris man behind me, there's going to be in trouble," in Old English. And so I skipped away rather rapidly, straight down the high street. I looked round, he was running down behind me, full speed. And I found the troop, and there was about 40 of us. So I went smashing into this troop, and we all ended up into the pub, including the policeman. And the policeman stopped dead, turned round and said, "I wondered how I was going to get a pint." Walked over, ordered a pint, picked it up, went and stood outside with the Morris men, had a photograph taken of him with a pint of beer, with all the Morris men in full uniform and everything else. So the press loved it. They were taking all these photographs. There was complete chaos where the cars should have been, because everybody was trying to get the mess that had all been caused and everything else. And after about 10 minutes, he went, "I better go and sort that lot out." The pint had disappeared, and he wandered back to his duties so the parade could come past again and everything else. And that was the bit that got caught in the press. Okay. So there's lots of stories like that. Okay.
I wonder whether he got in trouble, but well, he did become a celebrity. He got his famous.
I doubt very much. It's policing with integrity, it was called.
Well, tradition comes first, obviously.
Well, absolutely. It's a carnival. Okay. So yeah.
Here's
so
the
that's
second
it.
question. You did say you are at the borders between England and the Welsh
The
So
Welsh, the Welsh, yeah.
Wales, yeah, the Welsh people. So I've read and heard rumors, I don't know if it's a fact, that actually Wales is um, the oldest part, what remains of what used to be England before conquerors. What do you think?
Well, it's called the Brythonic languages, and like you, I'm looking at someone from Greece and someone from Italy, right? Our cultures and our generations go back thousands of years. We've
Yeah.
had before the Romans come, we had the hill forts.
Mhm.
The old word for the Cornish is the West Welsh. There were certainly people living here. Um, a long time ago, and they had their own cultures and things like that. To say that anybody's older than anybody is really going to be a difficult thing to say. Um, are the Greeks older than the Italians, or the Italians older than the Greeks, or do the Egyptians come before all three of you? You know what I mean? So it's that the only time in my lifetime, and in anybody I can remember, when the border was closed, where the Welsh and the English, and there's the border, and that border was closed so people couldn't go backwards and forwards across it because it's an open border, was in the COVID times. And when we had the lockdowns, England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, the COVID authorities were separated out from the United Kingdom. And so the Welsh could do different things to the English and things. And so that at that time, the border was closed. And it is the only time in my lifetime I can remember it. And they were crazy times, but there is a golf course up in Oswald Street. It's along here, and there's 15 holes in England, and there's 3 holes in Wales. And they closed the 3 holes in Wales off because you could play golf in England, but you couldn't play golf in Wales. And so they came and closed them off. And that is the only time I've known. And the border, like all borders, well, like a lot of borders in Europe, has changed backwards and forwards depending on who's been around in 1220 and 1980 and 607, whatever it is. Right? But the one thing I would say is that Shrewsbury was 3,000 people, Hereford was 2,000 people in year 700 about. There's an awful lot of space. If that's all the people that are living here, there's an awful lot of space here now. All right. So borders weren't that important, probably. Okay.
Mike, well, you talked to us about the origin story, as you called it, but you also mentioned, well, you mentioned Amy Douglas, and you mentioned the festival that you run. And I was wondering, since Despina has already been there, but I've never been there, could you tell me a little bit about the festival and
Well,
our audience, of course?
right. So the original festival we started was Festival at the Edge, which was 1990, around then somewhere. And I did that for 10 years. And then I was running the companies as well back in those days. And the first hour of every day I spent running a festival. So after 10 years, I said someone else is going to have to do it. And so other people have taken it on since then. Um, the second festival is Get a Word in Edgeways. And before, about 2016, I went to the pub, you're going to hear a lot about pubs, you two ladies. I went to the pub, and there was in Much Wenlock, which is the little town that I live in. I live in the suburbs of. The high street was looking very sad. There was shops were closing. One of the pubs was closed, and you could just see that it was on a sink sort of profile. It was going downhill, and it's a funny little place, but it happens to be our funny little place. And it used to have a poetry festival and a storytelling festival, and both had left for whatever reasons. The poetry festival had stopped because the lady running it had been unwell, and the Festival of the Edge had gone on its troubles. So the councillors sat down and said, "We've got to do something about this, Mike. This is our community. How do we get these festivals back again?" And so what I said was, we roll the two into one. So it's not poetry and it's not storytelling. It's everything, and will apply to the ACE. ACE is called the Arts Council of England. We call it ACE. So we made an application to them, telling them the whole story, and they gave us £14,000. So then I had to run a festival again. That's how it started. So now I've got a team of people around me, half a dozen or so in the core, and then we've got all the other people that help and everything else. And we're doing our third one in October, and that's back in the town more than it's in a field like Glastonbury and places like that. So Get a Word in Edgeways, we call it. So if you know me, it's a good name. Get a Word in Edgeways. Okay.
The origin of the name, is it I I remember maybe it was Kath Edwards who helped you with the name.
It wasn't Kath. Kath was on the team for a bit. She decided not to be. Very fine lady. Um, it was Anne who first came it up, and with Simone. It was Anne and Dave. We were sat in the on the green by the church, and we were thinking of names. And she turned around and said, and I've been talking a lot. She said, "Why don't you call it Get a Word in Edgeways? Because no one can get a word in Edgeways." And everybody just laughed, and I thought that was a good name. And so we told it to Radio Shropshire, which is the BBC, our local radio station, and they just, all the presenters there, they thought it was ever so funny. They were just laughing their heads off when I told them that, and they said, "Yeah." So I said, "Right, we use that as a name," and we used it ever since. So yeah,
It's a great name. So if there are any non-English people listening to this, it is an idiom actually. It means that everybody is trying to talk at the same time and you're struggling to get a word in edgeways to be heard somehow among the confusion and the noise everybody else is making. But that's not what's happening in the actual festival. It's very well organized. There are different things happening at the same time at different venues. So you can choose which one you want to attend. And every time there is one particular event, a storyteller or music or whatever, it's very clear. It's not confusing. It's very relaxing and enjoyable. So people are welcome to go there, and they're going to have a good time if they get there.
that was very that was very kind of you to say all that, Despina. How much is the invoice going to be?
It's not kind because I am not a very kind person per se. I am a very honest person, and that should be acknowledged. So other than that, people who are going to be hearing about this, they're going to be listening to GAWI, which is the initials. It's an acronym of Get a Word in Edgeways. So we're going to call it GAWI. And luckily, I think it's very fortunate for all of us that Mike has suggested that this podcast, the next season of this podcast, will be under the wing of GAWI. And you know what? I really like the name GAWI because it sounds somehow Arthurian, Mike. Right?
Yes, absolutely. You've been a couple of times, and I want you to come again this year to the fire station, which I'm sure you're beginning to love. So we have a fire station, which is where we do our hybrid stuffs and do some podcasts from the festival itself. And my people, well, I sound very grand. Malcolm and the others, they're going to help you advertise the podcast, which is, I think the storytelling world could do with a podcast. There's been a couple that have been tried, but they've been restricted a bit. And I mean, it's a really difficult thing you're attempting to do. And I really hope it goes well for you. And I wanted to throw in for what we can do to help you with the contacts and things and get the name out so people will listen to it. And so we are trying to help with that, yes. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a win-win because, there's going to be awareness raised for the festival, the actual festival. And for people who want to get there, it's every October, every year. So it's like, what would it be? Would it be harvesting time, Mike?
Well, the reason it's in October is that the tourist season in the UK finishes around September. So it starts around Easter and it finishes around September. And all the people that don't go to Greece and Italy who want to stay in the UK, and they tend to be the people with dogs. So we have a lot of people that, you get a lot of people hop on an airplane and say, "I'm off to Sicily for 10 days," and they sit on. The people with dogs don't tend to want to do that, or the people who want to stay here for whatever family reasons, stay vacations, they're called nowadays. So that sort of starts to dip at the end of September. So we consciously put the festival in October because it makes it a destination resort. It makes it a place where people come to. And every family that comes to Much Wenlock, and that's a mum and dad and two children, spend in the region of £500 in the 21st century. In 2025, that's the figure they put on it. So if you take your husband, Despina, and your two children, and you come and stay in Much Wenlock, you're going to spend about £500 once you're here. That's to do with the hotels, the accommodation, the pubs, and things like that. And it sort of boosts the end of the year. And if we did it like that, and the town council asked us to do that, well, we were having discussions and things, and that was the date that came together. So Trudy, who's the town clerk, and Marcus, who is the mayor this year, will come and open the festival. And the town crier will announce that it's festival. And it's in October, designed to bring people into the place when it would have been quieter. Okay.
Marcus was the mayor last year as well, right?
You met the mayor last year. He
I
came
did, yeah.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated he's not doing a very long politician speech. He was kind of short and to the point.
Yes, well, we had told him that. Okay.
I think he
But
was
he's a-
following instructions, not the politician's instinct. Yeah,
Yes,
that explains it.
So, and the other thing to do to make it a community festival is that we have, on the Sunday morning, we have two storytellers in two different religious places, where instead of having a sermon in the Christian faith, you get a story from the Bible. But we don't stick with just the Christian faith. So over the years, we've had Muslims and Hindus and Jews and every other religion you can. And that's been very well received. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, Mike, all this talk about storytelling and stories, maybe it's time for you to tell us a story. Have you got a little story that you've got in
Right.
mind?
I have got one that I've been thinking about, and it seemed to be appropriate that I told you this. So I'm going to go back to the time when we talked about Rose, and Rose sent me off to Kington to the Swan pub to meet her uncle. And this is the story he told. There's an old family up there called Vaughans. Now, the Vaughans live on Hergus Ridge, and there's a great big house. And like in lots of things in England and the UK, some of these families can go back hundreds and hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, and this is one of those. And that Vaughan is the surname. So there's the saintly Vaughan and the educated Vaughan and the nice Vaughan. And there was the one that went hunting, and the one, for some reason, who went knitting. And there was one that helped all the community. And of course, there's every skeleton in everybody's cupboard. There was Blackthorn. And Blackthorn, he was a really nasty sod. He was somebody who would up to all the rents and was unkind to all the ladies and robbed everybody. And he went out at night, and he was the hobbies he had in those days were banned then, would be banned now, but there was no one to catch him because he was in charge of everything. And in the end, he died, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. But then he started coming back. He couldn't see any reason to stop his favourite hobby, so he came back as a bear, sometimes as a wolf, and sometimes as a great big black man, particularly on market days. And on the market days, people would go and sell all their wares, have a few drinks, and start walking back across up into the hills, and he'd catch them then. So people decided to go to different places. So instead of going to Knighton, they go to Kington, or they go to Prestine, or they go to some of the other towns and villages around. And of course, Kington was suffering. People weren't coming in. It's called footfall nowadays. Footfalls were down. So they went to the abbot, and they said to the abbot, "You're going to have to do something about this." Well, the abbot was only a small little man. He was I feel sorry for him. I haven't got some empathy with him nowadays. They said he was 5 foot, under 5 foot or so. And he was just a little old 70-year-old man. And so he said, "What am I supposed to do?" And they said, "You're the abbot. Someone's got to put a stop to this." So all he could think of doing was going into the church, and he said, "Right, we're going to pray him into a golden box." And they all looked around and said there had to be a religious person of some kind. It had to be a nun or a vicar or a prior or someone from outside the abbey world, just a minister of some kind. They had to be religious as well. There had to be 12 of them, and they'd sit in a circle. with a candle in front of them on the floor, and they'd sit down on a chair and they'd pray. Now, this isn't the prayers we do nowadays, that you go to church and you pray for 10 minutes and then you're 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 55 minutes on. Every hour is called by an hourglass. You can have something to drink, and you can go to the toilet, and you can sit down and you do 12 hours in a row. And you just pray the old medieval prayers in every language you could think of. And you had to sit down in the chair and put your hands like this right in front of you. So that's what they did. And in the first 12 hours, they prayed old Black Vaughan from up in the hills, and they brought him into the town. And in the second 12 hours, they brought him around the town, and he was going round the chimneys, but they were just praying. The prayers were pulling them into the church. And then finally they got to the first 24 hours, and just then they got him into the church. Well, he didn't want to be in the church, and they prayed and they prayed and they prayed, but they could not at any time get him. They were slowly bringing him down, and where every break he had to stop and he'd go up a bit, and the nuns would come in, and they did a 12 hours with females only, and that worked well, and it was coming down, and there was some heart in it. And in the end, he was pulling them down, and the little gold box was at the bottom there, and he was a couple of feet above, and they was hovering around, and they doubled it all up. And they said, well, get him in now. So the abbot turned him, and they doubled it all up, and so they had 24 people there, and they prayed and they prayed and they prayed. And in the end, the abbot knew. Suddenly, something came into his heart, and he knew. And he walked into the circle, and he picked the box up, and he went quiet. And there was a complete silence. And he said, follow me. He said, use the prayer our Lord gave us. And he started, Our Father, thou art in heaven. And as he said the old prayer that Jesus our Lord had said all those years ago, that was the prayer that did it. And Black Vaughan, as he came and he was sucked into the golden box, and the abbot saw him there, and he snapped the top on and said these immortal words, now what do I do? As he's standing there, he said, now what do I do? What am I going to do now? And they all sort of said, we don't know. We're going for a cup of tea. And they left him standing there in the middle of the church with a gold box with Black Vaughan in it. And he said, what do we do? What do we do? And one of the old farmers came back and said, the only thing you can do is put him in the bottom of the lake. Put him on the bottom of the lake, and we'll put a slate on top of him, and make sure that's a gold box. Because the reason it's a gold box is because gold doesn't deteriorate in any way at all. You put gold in the ground and it will stay there for all those years. It's better than lead, better than everything. So that's why they put it in there. They took it to a lake, they drained the lake, and the abbot was just standing there holding the box. And he put the box in, and they put a slate on the top of it, and they wrote a spell into that slate. And it was the old magic, not the new magic, because they had to make sure he didn't come out. So on one side of the slate, there was the Lord's Prayer, but underneath, there was an old spell from the hills and the old religions and stuff like that. They wrote that in as well, just as a double shot. And they put it in, and they filled the lake up. And what that spell said was they would be there for 1,000 years. And at the end of 1,000 years, the stone would break, the lid of the coffin of the little casket, the coffin of Black Vaughan would open, and Black Vaughan would come out. And that's the story that I was told in the Swan. So I looked at him and I said, so when did all that happen? Now, this was in 1978. And he said, oh, that was about 980, Mike, 1,000 years ago, right? And I went, oh, was it? And everybody in the pub started laughing. Right? I went, right. So when I used to tell that story, I always told it. That was the first date I ever used. I can remember doing it. I stood in the pub down up with the Morrisman, and I told them this story, and everybody laughed. I said, that was 1,000 years ago, and it was told in 980. Well, I took it up to 990 for a bit, and the year 2000 was way in the calendar. 2000 was a big one. And so I used to call it, nowadays when I tell it, I think I'm up to about 2030. Depends. It's always about 5 or 6 years ahead. Okay, 10, 30, 1,000 years ago. But the strange thing was about it all that about 15 years ago, so we're talking about 2010 now, I was up there and I go there for a drink from time to time because I'm traveling backwards and forwards. And so they're all laughing. And they said, Mike said, you've got to hear this because one of the lakes, there's two lakes up there and they're not quite sure which one it is. But the one lake, they wanted to landscape. And so now these are nothing to do, you understand. Everybody in the world who's listening to this will understand that a couple of blokes turned up with a JCB and a lorry, and they were going to redo the dam of the lake, and da 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 da. And as the bucket of the JCB touched the water, all the water started bubbling, and smoke started coming out of it. And these lads, they were just lads who lived there. They went. We wondered if this was where Blackthorn was, and if Blackthorn's in there, that's the last thing we're doing is any work in this lake. Turned around and took all the kit away. And the guy who owned it said, well, aren't you going to do any work in the lake? And they went, no, we're not. And if you want to know any more about it, there's a storyteller around here. One's called Mike Rust. He'll tell you all about it. So that was Blackthorn. And that was, I tell it from this time. I like telling it. And it's, for me, it's got resonance because of how I learned it in the first place, right? And it also, while we're talking about all these things and everything else, it is very typical of that kind of story that I was telling at that time in my life, then in the 1980s. I've got quite a few stories quite like that I collected from the Forest of Dean, from Hereford to Chester and back again, both sides of the border. All right, so that's why I picked it. Okay, is that okay for you? Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, most of the stories I've heard you tell will include usually some kind of royalty or some kind of ecclesiastic persona, and they are connected to the land and the toponyms, and it's like kind of folk slash historical tales, I'd say, right?
Right, so I wanted to collect the traditional British tales, right, the ones that go back into our history and everything else. So I did two things. First off, I went and I found if there's someone like a saint. Now, let's pick on Saint Nicholas because that's a good one that we all know, right? We call him Father Christmas, is Papa Noel, and all the other names that he's got in every different language. But he was a real man somewhere. I do believe that some of these old myths and legends, there is a root of truth in them somewhere. But we all know that St. Nicholas was an old man. So I went and found what I considered to be the version of St. Nicholas. Then I started collecting saint stories. And so the saint stories, there's St. Wolfram, there's St. Hugh, there's St. Bartholomew, and I probably got a dozen of those. And they come from the history of England mainly, some from Ireland and some from Scotland. And they are normally connected to the church or they're connected to the royal houses or the dukedoms and stuff like that. The other things I wanted was the travelling community. And so I went and found a fellow called Duncan Williamson, who in the UK is very, very famous. So I wrote him a letter in 1985. And I found his address. I wrote him a letter and said I'd like to meet him. And we got a letter back saying phone this phone number. So I had to go to a telephone box, and I don't think we had a telephone in the house. I know with mobile phones, and anybody who's under 20 listening to this, you're going to sound as if I'm in a museum. But I had to go to a little box at the end of the street, put some money in, and make a call like that. And he said, I spoke to him. He said, "Well, come and visit with me." And I said, "Well, that's very kind. I've got a wife and two children." He said, "I'll bring them as well." So we went all the way to the Highlands of Scotland from Herefordshire, which is about a 9-hour car drive in the car that I had at the time. Lynn and the two kids at the front, in the back, right? And that was the first time I met Duncan Williamson, and that was the first time I had whiskey for breakfast. So we got there Friday at 9 o'clock in the evening, and we just told stories and sang songs and everything till 6 o'clock in the morning. And then he said, "You need aliveness." So we had whiskey for breakfast. And then we told stories from 10 o'clock in the morning right the way through. We went to a ceilidh and a storytelling session in the evening. We got back and we told stories all the way through. And Sunday morning, Lynn said, if you tell another story, I'm going to divorce you. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you're going to go to sleep for a couple of hours, then we're going home. I've got to go to work tomorrow morning. And that it took that to stop it. Right. So I went and had a couple of hours sleep. The kids and Linda and Lynn had there was Tommy and whatever Duncan's older daughter was at the time. It's not Amy. I'll think about it in a minute. And they'd been swimming and they'd been swimming in the sea and they'd been having ice creams and things. Me and Duncan had just sat at his kitchen table swapping stories for the whole of the time. And we got in the car. 10 minutes later, I went to sleep in Fife and I woke up in Herefordshire. And Lynn had driven all the way back, all by herself. And I'd just gone to sleep in the passenger seat. I spoke to her a couple of days, afterwards about it. Or she said, the last thing I was going to do is let you drive the car with me and the kids in it. Right. And we stopped twice at services for an hour and you didn't even wake up.
Oh, that must
right.
have been
And because that was the first time I met him many times afterwards. I met Johnny Campbell, who was from Ireland, and Stanley Robinson, who was from Scotland, and Eddie Lenihan, and some of these guys, and Liz Weir was the first time. We had business interests in the north of Ireland. The north of Ireland is Ulster, which is part of the UK and not part of it's on the island of Ireland, but it's not. It's the way that we do it over in the United Kingdom. It was the first time I'd met her, but we had some business interests over there in the mushroom industry at the time. And so I was over there quite a lot. So I met Johnny Campbell, and these boys I was the youngster, so I was 10 years or so younger than them. And they're mostly dead now. In fact, I think they're all dead. And I was collecting stories, and I wanted the old British tales. The tales of the British Isles was the ones that I was looking into. And the other lot I collected were the Jack stories. And Jack in the Beanstalk? That is one of a series, and they tend to be traveller stories. They're from the travelling community, the Romany stories. So I collected all of those as well. So I know a whole load of those as well. And like I said, it was my hobby. It was something when I wasn't working and I could do with Lynn and the kids and everything else.
A small parenthesis before you carry on. Hold that train of thought.
Yeah.
Have you considered publishing the Jack Tales?
Right. I have tried to write 3 books over the years, and they've been a complete failure. I'm very badly dyslexic, and sitting down and writing a book, I'm sure everybody finds it extremely easy, but I found it extremely difficult. And so I wrote a novel, and I even had a publisher say they would publish it, and then they didn't. The books you need to look at with the stories that I or we would want to be in are the ones that Amy Douglas had written. So Amy Douglas has done the folk stories of the British Isles. She's done she's a published authoress. She has half a dozen books that she's, and any stories that I've wanted to be published in the written word, they are there. So I know that they're there.
That's good to know. So how did you name me?
Just to carry on, I need to finish this point. Right. In the 1880s in North Wales, there was a reverend called John Jones, and he was a Methodist. I think he was a Methodist, but what he used to do is he used to go to the church. This is Snowdonia, so this is the mountains of North Wales, where they all speak a different language. They have their own language over there. It's called the Welsh language. My Welsh is terrible nowadays, but he went round and he collected all these stories, converted them into English, and wrote them into a book. Right. So when I found this book in the library in Aberystwyth, you know where you open a book and the outside of 2 pages is still joined up. That means nobody's read it. So I picked up this book. I was reading it and no one had read it because this was happening. So I took it to the student who was in the library and she just got some scissors out and cut them, which I wouldn't have done. And I got all those stories and I started telling those stories. They were converted into English. I've spoken to some of the Welsh speakers and they're in the process. Fionn Phillips and Fiona, they're taking them back into the Welsh language. And I thought he did do a really good job because he kept those stories alive. But when you write them down, once they're on the page, they stay on the page. And it takes a storyteller to bring them back to life again, right? So it's different. You have to perform the story sometimes more than just read it from a book. And he must have been a lovely old man, and I'd have liked to have met him. He died probably 70 years before I was born. But I didn't want some of the stories I've got to spend 70 years in a book when I looked at them. And so I haven't done a book for that reason. The ones I wanted to be in a book are in books, but they're in other people's books, and that's happy. I'm happy with that. That's not a problem. And I have decided just recently that I am finding people, someone like you, Simone, who I would meet in Marrakesh, and I say, well, I've got a story she might be interested in. And that somewhere along the way, I'll sit down there and you'll be in the audience and I'll see you and I go, I think you'll be interested. And I'll tell the story. And I'm only just getting into this, but so far, about 8 out of 10 times I've done it. Someone's come over and said, that's a lovely story, Mike. Can I use it? And I'm getting it right. But it's so that's how I'm doing it now. So I didn't get the stories to keep them. I got the stories to give them away.
Yes,
Right.
and goes for all of us. I think that's the best way to go around stories. Stories are to be shared, not to be
Yeah.
held, clinged upon exclusively.
Yeah. So
So,
an old shepherd told me down in the Forest of Dean, he said, stories are only alive when they've been told. And stories, and if they're not alive, what good are they?
yes, absolutely true.
That's what
So
he
you
told
have
me.
you have mentioned the name of Amy Douglas several times. And now my question is, did you meet her through Duncan or did she get to meet Duncan through you? How did it go?
Right. So the first storytelling club we had was at the Wenlock Edge Inn in 1988. Taffy Thomas came down. We'd been at Bromyard Folk Festival. He came up. It was a Monday night. He stayed with us because we knew him, and we started it was a September, and Amy turned up. She was 14 years old with her mum and dad. And she'd been at Bromyard. She'd heard we were doing this, and she came along and sat there. And she was about the same height at 14 as she is now, which is taller than me. But and this is going out worldwide and everything else. I will say this: she was slightly smaller than she is now, in thinner, because she was 14 years old. But she was about the same height. And it was her dad turned up, who's called Brian, who was a fellow called Dougal, who turned out to be a great friend of mine, and her mum Jackie. And that's when she first told the story. So she was coming along and she was learning the stories and everything else. And we went to Fylde Folk Festival. I got booked there, and Amy was about 16 then. And she said, could I come? So Jackie and Lynn sorted it out. So now we've got a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, and Jake would have been about 12. And off we go to a folk festival, you see. So I get there. And now Amy's got the money for the ticket. Her mum and dad gave them, which was about £70 in those days. And so we walk in, and Mike was the storyteller. I've got Lynn and the 3 kids. And Alan Bale went, oh, we've only got you down for 2 kids. And I went, Alan, don't make a fuss about it. Lynn gets upset. And he went, oh, sorry, Mike. And he turned around and said, give him another kid's ticket, you see. So they gave Amy a ticket at 16, and it was an artist's pass, because that's all they had. Right? So we could go into all the green rooms and stuff like that. Okay, and Fylde was a really big folk festival. Right. So anyway, so that was the day she became my storytelling daughter. That's the expression we use. All right. So this happened quite up until she was about 18, and I knew Duncan by then, so I sent her off to Duncan, and she came back when her dad decided she was old enough to go and see a strange man in Scotland by herself. She was about 17 or 18, going off to university and stuff like that. So we're over at Whitby Folk Festival, which we'll get to talk about in a minute. And all the directors of the festivals were all at the bar. So there was Chris from Selby, there was Malcolm from Whitby itself, there was Alan Bell, and 1 or 2 of the others. And they were talking to Amy's dad, Brian. And I was the other side of the room. And I could see Brian go, no, Amy's not Mike's daughter. Amy's my daughter. And I was going, oh, cripes, I'm in trouble here. Anyway, so Malcolm Story came over and said, go to the bar and buy some beer. I had to buy about a gallon of beer. And so take it home and put it on the table. But they were all laughing. So that's how that came about. And so then Amy went to university and she became famous. Okay.
We're going to have Amy here as a muse on the second season of this podcast. Probably.
Right, you ask her. You ask her. Right. I'm going to be really interested in her version of all that.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, actually, her version was the first one I got to hear about the famous Duncan Williamson's breakfast.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I heard her version first. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So you wanted to tell us something about the Whitby Festival, you said?
Whitby is right. So what I could do, because I didn't want to be a full-time storyteller, in the summertime we could go away to a festival and Lynn and the kids could come with us, and we were dancing with the Morris teams anyway, and we liked festivals and we were doing that. So if the team was there, I'd say to the festival, I'm here as well, and they say, oh, if you're part of that, you come and tell some stories and stuff. So the two big ones in England are Sidmouth Folk Week, which is on the south coast of England. You go any further south, you've got to go to France. And Whitby, which is up in the northeast and is opposite Denmark, sort of up that kind of place. Okay. So we went down to Sidmouth, did that a couple of times. In between times, I did a small festival that you won't have heard of called Glastonbury. And so I was a storyteller in the green fields at Glastonbury. The year Tom Jones was there, one of the years Tom Jones was there. And then we got Whitby Folk Week. And I was really pleased because that was the three that I wanted to do. So I've done Sidmouth, I've done Whitby, Glastonbury. Now I'm doing Whitby, and I'm going, cool, this isn't getting any better. We're going to have to go to some strange places like Scotland or Ireland or something. This is going to, you know what I mean? So he goes up to Whitby, and the fee at Whitby was £250 for the week and a cottage or accommodation in the old town. Now, the old Whitby goes back to, they've got a Priory, Hilda's Priory Monastery up there that goes back to 672. So it's an ancient village. And the cottage they gave us was an ancient cottage right in the middle of the old town. And it was 3 bedrooms and a tiny little place. But that was part of the fee to go to the festival, tickets for everybody, and £250 to get me there as a fee, and £50 if the festival made any money for expenses. And that was 1992 or something like that. And that fee didn't change for 30 years. It was exactly the same. I did try to get it up, but they wouldn't put it up in at all. Lynn, who I was talking about a bit, comes from about 30 miles north of there. So, and I call them the outlaws. There's the in-laws and there's the outlaws. So the first year we're there, I'm doing some storytelling. I wander back into our house and there's my mother-in-law and all Lynn's relatives all just sat round in our cottage and waiting for me to come back, and then we're all having a family meal somewhere in one of the hostilities. And we absolutely loved it for those reasons and everything else. Anyway, so I got to know Malcolm, and so I became part of the management team for a while that I was up there. And I was always going backwards and forwards. And one year they had a comms list, it was called communications list, and the mobile phones was in, and it went, Malcolm Story, Festival Director, Mike Rust, Best Boy. And I looked at him and said, what's best boy be? And he goes, you can do all the things I don't want to do. And so that was it. So, and I did that for about 5 years. And I'd done all sorts of things up there. And I stopped going about 2016 when I was about 60. And Lynn and I thought we'd have a break. And around then, it was about the time Getting Edgeways was getting started. I just needed a break from everything. So I stood back for a year or so and didn't do anything at all. At the end of about 1955 to about 1960, I decided to have a break from it all and go and do some other stuff. We had a boat on the river and one or two other things. But as soon as they put me on the river with a boat, I was looking for the stories of who made the bridge and all that kind of stuff. So it was all bubbling. Okay. So that's Whitby. And then finishing up, Malcolm turned around one day and said, which storytellers should we have then? And I went, oh, I'll pick the storytellers for you. So we had Duncan Williamson, we had Stanley Robinson, we had Johnny Campbell, we had Amy Douglas seemed to turn up a lot. Eddie Lenihan used to come down, and then you could be there with a week. I was there for a full week, 3 or 4 times longer than that with Duncan. Duncan came every year for a long time. Stanley Robinson came down, and Johnny Campbell I had a lovely time with Johnny Campbell for two or three. Pat Ryan. Would you fellas know all these names? I'm not sure you fellas would know all these names. These are the old boys in the British Isles that.
Some of them we do. Some of them
Yeah.
we've heard before.
Yeah. And so we were just sat there as storytellers, swapping stories mainly, and just hanging out, I think is the current expression. Hanging out. Okay.
Sounds wonderful, Mike. And well, we may have saved the I don't know, not the best. We saved this for the end of the podcast episode, because at the beginning of the podcast, even before we started recording, you showed us some musical instruments that you've got there, and we were wondering, so do you play these musical instruments? What's the story behind them? Do you use
So,
them with stories? And would you like to play us something?
right. The answer is yes, and we can have a look at the standard recording afterwards. When I was in my 40s, I was up in Whitby. I decided I wanted to play a musical instrument. When I was a kid, I didn't get a chance to learn it. And so I went to a proper music shop and bought a proper plastic recorder. Do you know what a recorder is? The blowy things. Do you do recorders? Everybody does recorders, yeah. And so I went to the lessons, and when I came back, Métis said to me, "You have to practice 15 minutes every day." So I got a brand new music stand, a brand new piece of paper with a tune on it, and a brand new recorder. And I sat on our decking, and when I got back one Monday afternoon, and I practiced everything I knew. And that took 1 minute. So I had another 14 minutes to practice, and I didn't have anything else to do. And that was the start. And I was about 44, 45 when I did that. That transposed into playing the Irish whistles and flutes. And I got to grade 3 in flute when I decided I didn't want to play anymore, do any more exams. So I stopped that. So when I was 60, I went and bought a nickel harper. I was looking at pipes, the bagpipes types things, because they're blowy things. And I understood those. And then I saw Vicky Swan. And so I went and bought a nickel harper, which is something that the Saxons and the Vikings used to play back in the day. And if you go to Stockholm, there's a statue of a monk playing one, and they built the statue in 1120. And this monk was so famous, they decided to build a statue of him in those days. And so there's not many people in the British Isles that played them very often, but I liked it. And it's basically a cousin to a hurdy-gurdy, and it's bits of wood moving backwards and forwards and things like that. And I don't mind playing a few tunes. We'll go back to some of the tunes we were talking about with the Morris teams and everything else. I can play that, and you can just fade it out if that's how it works. But it cost me when you buy a musical instrument. What's the best way of saying this? Every time you come home, your wife asks you how expensive it is, and you always half the price. So if someone comes home and says, "I've just bought a musical instrument and it costs £2,000," it probably costs £4,000 because you're not going to ask them. And if a nurse at my age asks you what your love life is like, they always halve it. So if you goes 4 times a month, they go 2 times a month. Now, if you want to leave that in the recording, you can. So I bought a nickel harper 10 years ago, and it's my time out, and I quite enjoy playing it. And I'll see if I can get a tune out of it for you. I've spent all my time collecting these old stories, and that's been my way of it. But I think the future for storytelling in the UK isn't going to be there. I think that they've all been collected, and there's lots of people telling them all, and everybody's drinking from the same well. Now, the story rounds I've run in the past, we've had people come along and they've said, I want to tell a personal story. But when it says a personal story, what they mean is they basically want some counselling because someone in their life has died, or they've gone blind, or they've been divorced, or they've been domestically abused, or da 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 da. And they're sitting on the stage, and I've got people who have spent £10 to listen to stories. And instead of taking their time slot, which is 8 to 10 minutes or so normally in the story round or something, they're now doing an hour or 40 minutes, and they're telling everybody their life story about how bad life has been for them. They're very rarely good stories. They're always something to do with a malady or an illness of some kind. And so I've been against them. And I've in the story rounds that I've done, I've been saying to people, I don't particularly want the storytelling to be personal stories for those reasons. Now, just recently, in the last year or so, in some of the story rounds that I've been in, people have been coming to tell what they call personal stories. And the personal stories are more along the lines of the ones that Rachel Smith tells from Canada. I went to the States for a month, and that side of the pond, they tell a lot of personal stories or made up stories. They haven't got the tradition that we have. So they will say, I wrote this story 3 weeks ago and stuff like that. And that's fine. There's lovely stories and lovely people. I've got no problems with that. But what I think is going to happen in the UK looking forward is that more people are going to tell stories out of their own lives. And as long as they're entertaining and they're not some kind of therapy or counselling that they really need to do with trained practitioners in private, I want to encourage that. And so I think I'm talking to John Rowe and Lucy at the moment about the guys from Marrakesh, but at our festival, I think we're going to have a session on this with the people who are here, not telling personal stories. I'm going to have a look into where the future is for storytelling in the UK. And I think this is going to be a big part of it. And I know because of where I started, the journey that I've been on, people quite happily say, because they were rightly saying, to be fair, oh, Mike doesn't particularly like personal stories. It's not that I don't like them, it's that I found them not to be appropriate in the spaces where I've been. And so we're going to encourage them here and see where we go. We may be wrong, and it may just fizzle out like a candle in the dark room, and all we're going to a bit of smoke and mirrors. But I do think it's a way that other people are going to come into storytelling, because they're going to tell some personal stories. Then they're going to find, oh, who's this bloke Robin Hood? What happened to Little John and his pillow? And off they'll go again. And if you think about it, Little John and his pillow story is, if you don't know it, you must all know who Robin Hood is. You must all know who Robin Hood is. There's all these strange folk legends. We've got the best one of all in England. He robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. He's the most famous of all. But the story about Little John and somebody nicking his pillow is, when you think about it, it's just a personal story. It was just told 500 years ago. And so I just wanted to add it now. If you can get this into the podcast, or if you want to do another podcast or have a discussion about this, Despina, particularly when you're here in October, I'm going to put you into one of those sessions. That session when we're going to, I wanted to have a debate about it more than I want to do personal story. And I wanted to say here in public on your podcast where I am with that. Anyway, so I thought I'd chuck that in.
Tell us about your story round so people can be informed and come there and share tales, and give us a very, very short tale to finish it with.
Right. The story round is in the Pottery in Much Wenlock. It's the second Monday of the month through the winter. So it starts in September. It's going to finish probably in April this year because of the way the Easter is. And then we have a festival, as we spoke about before, in October every year. Story rounds are good. because it gets people who gives them a chance. But our story round isn't a story round nowadays. It is a poetry round. It's a round of the spoken word, and we have music. Now the first ones we did, we had to sort of ring fence them so it was stories only, because people would turn up and say strange things like, "I'm going to tell you this story. But it was turned into a song. They now call them a ballad, so I'm going to sit and sing it." And he goes, "No, I don't want you to sing a story. I want you to tell a story." And so we had to stop all that. But nowadays, I encourage you to come and tell a ballad if you want to, a story song, which includes country and western. Yeah, you don't have to stick with the folk English, British folk traditions and everything else. Somebody's sitting up like Dolly Parton or something like that. A lot of her songs and the country and western songs are story songs. And so anybody who plays live or performs, so people turn up and they do creative writing and they read some of their creative writing and stuff like that. Okay. A short story to finish. If you take the road from Much Wenlock to Church Stretton, as you go over the hill at the top, there's a pub and it's called the Wenlock Edge Inn. It's called the Wenlock Edge and it's 18 miles and it's right in the heart here of Shropshire, and I can actually see it from where I am. And 150 odd years ago, they used to have races up there. So they have races, and these aren't race horses, these are farm horses, and they're having a day out. So you take old Dolly from the local farm and you put your son on him and they have races and they gamble and they drink some beer and they gamble, have a day out with the kids and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so on the last race that time, they were coming along the road and the jockey, they put some bales of straw and they had to jump over these bales of straw, and he jumped over, he fell off. And as he fell off, his arm landed flat, and the horse behind, who was a great old plough horse with a great big metal foot on it, landed on his elbow and cut his elbow completely off. It severed it completely, is the expression, and he fainted. Now, this is the bit I find a bit awkward, because the only thing they could think of to do is they put a tourniquet on him, went off and put the stump in a fire. So they just know how painful that is, God only knows, but they put a stump in the fire and he survived it. And they called him One Arm Joe for the rest of his life. But they wanted to know what to do with the arm. Now, the arm goes from the elbow to the fingers. And so they asked him. And what he said was, they were just building a wall out of the pub, put my arm in the wall and put the stones over the top of it, then I'll know where it is, and everybody else can know where it is, and I can come and find it if I want to. And in the evenings, I'll come and sit and talk to my arm. And they said, yeah, if that's what you want, that's what we do. And that's what they did. So they put the arm in the wall. Now, a couple of years later, someone's walking across. And now when it gets foggy and dark and it's a dark and stormy night and all that kind of thing, you can imagine it's the British Isles. There was an arm, and it's a left arm, and it's about 45 degrees, and it's like it's stopping you. So it's coming on and it's telling you to stop. And they go, what's this mean? And he goes, well, it's warning you of danger ahead, because he was ahead of the horse that got him. So there's danger ahead. So be careful if you go from here. Right. So a couple of times you sat in the pub having it. Somebody comes in and just saying, I was just seeing an arm in the middle of the road. And I was doing 30 miles an hour and I drove through it. What's all that? And so we have to sit and tell them a story about what happened. But what's happened is that there was danger ahead. And by you stopping here, that was half an hour ago now, so it should be safe. All right. So that was the story that I got told. Now, I was just in a different pub. All the famous storytelling I'd done and everything else, I was in a different pub, one of the local pubs. Wasn't doing any storytelling. I was with the cricketers. I played a lot of cricket. And we were sat down there, and the young farmers came in. And this young farmer, who's 17 years old, I saw her the other day. She's a mother with teenage kids nowadays. She walked in, sat down and said, I've got this ghost story for you, Mike, from the Wenlock Edge. You're bound to have heard it, but we're doing something for the young farmers. And she told me that, and I hadn't heard it. It had come from her grandfather. And I went, oh, that's very interesting. Made out I knew it, but I hadn't. And we went through it with her, and there was a young farmer competition, and she won it for the spookiest of all spooky stories.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time and for your energy and for your stories and for your music. By the way, I didn't know you could play before this session.
Yeah, you and I haven't had much time when I'm just being a storyteller and not being anything else, right? At some point, we'll sit down. Simone, I'm going to look forward to being in your company instead of you being on a screen at some point.
Me too.
We have met a few times over the years, and I've heard you tell stories. But when you're running festivals and things, you don't get a chance to tell stories yourself, which is one of the reasons I like Whitby so much, because I didn't have to bowl, so I could just be a storyteller again. And it took me a while to settle into Marrakesh. It's the first I couldn't go for the first two because Lynn's been unwell. It took me a couple of days just to just be a storyteller and nothing else,
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah,
it's nice.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
enjoyed it. We enjoy the different parts that storytelling brings in our lives.
Yeah. Okay.
Roles.
And I think what Badger's doing with Lucy, I think it's setting up. Yeah, it's opening doors across the way. I can spend another hour about where I think it's going to be in the future.
All
Have a nice
right,
day,
Mike,
guys.
thank you so much for your time and for all the stories that you told us. It
I'll
was
let you into a
wonderful.
secret. Every storyteller I know likes talking about themselves, but I do wish you well with your enterprise, and I'll do as much as I can to help you. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Well done. Well done.
Big thanks to
See you
Lynn.
then.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.